Hey everybody, I wanted to put this video together as a tribute to my good friend and past fellow knife maker, Tim Hancock. Tim Hancock's a legend in the industry, and we just recently lost him and his battle with Parkinson's disease. Tim was a legend, and every now and then in the knife world we lose somebody who really makes the knife world kind of stop, pause for a minute, and kind of think about what they meant. Tim was more than just a great maker and a hero of mine in the knife world, but he was a good, really good friend. We traveled to shows, stayed at shows together, stayed in the same hotel, room together, and I used that time as I was a young maker to just pick his brain like crazy and get input and tips. And Tim was always super sharing, super encouraging, and the knife world and myself both were gonna miss him. When Tim passed, I was in the middle of making this Dog Bone Dagger. This is a knife, this is a pattern, a knife, and everything on here that basically I learned from Tim. He walked me through the first one I made, showed me how he made them. He was kind of famous for making these. Everything that I did on here is a direct kind of, direct result of the knowledge that I gained from Tim. When Tim passed, I was in the middle of making this knife, and I was on vacation, and when I got home and I went back to work on it, all I could think was about Tim. Everything I was doing on it, I had Tim heavy on my mind. And so I thought the best way to honor Tim and his memory would be to teach you something I learned from Tim, about part of the making of a Dog Bone Dagger. And I'm gonna do a video and a how-to on how to put this last dome pin in this handle, the finishing touch on this knife. This knife is all glued up, it's all done. It needs sharpened and it needs a pin. This pin will go, the reason this pin is not in it right now is this pin will go directly through the tang of this knife. The tang of this blade goes back here just behind this pin. And so when this pin goes through this knife, it's actually going through the tang of this blade as well. So if the epoxy was to ever, for some reason, give up, this handle is pinned together in more ways than one here. So I will cover that in the video. I encourage you to Google Tim Hancock. There's other legends that we've had and we still have that have retired, or even some that are still making knives. Names like Don Fogg, Buster Orensky, Bill Moran, Steve Schwarzer, there's Larry Fagan, there's Ron Lake and Michael Walker. There's guys that have transcended the knife world, and they've led us to where we are today. And in this internet age of knife makers, the Forged in Fire stuff and Instagram, Facebook, the knife world's exploding. But there's not a lot of people that know some of these legends, which is a shame. There's so many guys I see putting stuff up that they say, well, I came up with this or I came up with that, when Don Fogg did it 25 years ago, or Steve Schwarzer did it 20 years ago. So we owe it to those guys to take the time to get to know the legends that came before us, and Tim Hancock was one of those. So I hope you enjoy the video. I hope you find it informative, and I hope you go out and buy Tim Hancock's book, The Western Bladesmith. We're actually working on getting it, maybe going to get it reprinted. It's not just a book about Tim and his knives, but he shows how to do things in there. It's the cheapest form of instruction that you could possibly get. $100 book, and you're getting thousands of dollars worth of knowledge, a lifetime worth of knowledge from Tim. So let's get to work on this. Let's get this pin done and do it in honor of our past amazing bladesmith and forever in our hearts friend, Tim Hancock. All right, the first step in making a dome pin for this dagger is we got to actually form our domed heads. So this is a head right here that I actually already formed prior to doing this before I knew I was going to do this video. All this is a piece of flat gold. I just order flat, and you can actually order gold circles, or you can order gold sheet and punch out your circles. You have less waste by just ordering the gold circles. I get those from like Hoover and Strong. But when I do make those, this is a dapping block set right here, and that piece of flat gold sits in there, and then you just take a hammer and you just pound down on it. And I can actually show you, this is just a little piece of scrap gold here. And you just hold your dapping head on there, and you just hit it, and it just forms right down in there. So when you're done, I mean, you got that's just a piece of scrap, but you got a nice little dome. So that's all that I did. That's a piece of scrap gold right there. So once you do that, it's important, get this held, to get this part here flat. This is the shoulder that's going to be all sitting down on the handle all the way around. And all I do is just put a piece of sandpaper down on a hard surface, and I just run that dome back and forth on that piece of sandpaper, like 600 grit paper, and it makes it flat. Okay. So now that we've got that dome, and I've got another dome here, we've got our two heads made. And now it's time to solder a pin to the inside of that dome. And I'll show you that next. Okay, so I have positioned this gold dome on this plate here, and this is a gold pin. You have to use the same carat gold as your pin head. You can't use a different carat or it will show. But all I'm going to do here is just get a little dab of flux right on the end of that pin, and I position it right down in this head. Right down. It has to be, as close to the center as you can make it. But it's just sitting down in there, and that flux is right at the base. And so now I take a little piece of silver solder, and I'll actually cut this kind of in half here. So this is just a medium or even a soft silver solder. This is a medium here. And I just place that little piece of silver solder in there. And this is actually maybe even a little big. I'll trim a little more off of this. And I place that piece on this side. So I have two pieces of silver solder just sitting in that flux. And now all I need to do is just create some heat and sweat that down on there. You don't need a huge flame. This is just a little baby acetylene torch here. You don't need a huge flame or you'll melt your gold. So all I'm going to do is start with just applying a little heat to the actual pin, kind of above it. And you can hear that flux start to bubble, and then I'll start to apply some heat, and I'm actually applying it next to the pin head. I'm not even directly hitting that pin head. Now I don't like right now that my solder is wanting to fall out of there, so I'll just, as I heat that, I'll push that back up in there, and I apply a little more heat, and you'll see that solder, there it goes, it's starting to flow, and it'll suck right down in there, and that is soldered. You can see that solder flowed right down in and went right down where that flux was at the base of that pin. So that pin is now soldered on there solid. So now all I need to do is just kind of clean this pin head up just a little bit. This is a piece of 2000 grit sandpaper, because right now it's got some black oxide just on it from the heating process. So I'll just sit and run it by hand in here. And I'm twisting it as I'm going to not get any flat spots. Okay, that's cleaned up relatively well, and now we'll go buff it. Okay, I'm just going to do a light buff on it all the way around. Get that head. Now it's super polished. So now we're going to take that head that we've soldered on, that pin, and I'm going to run that through the handle. All right. And now that head is not sitting down perfectly flat here, if you can see that. See how that head is kind of sticking up on that handle a little bit? We're going to just take a hammer, and it shouldn't take a lot of force. And we're just going to drive that head down a bit. And that looks like it worked pretty good, maybe a little more. And now that head is sitting nice and flat on that wood with no gap. So now we need to cut this pin off and leave plenty on the other side to peen our pin on. So I'm going to go in about right here and cut that. Okay, so now we have extra head or extra pin sticking up through that handle. And the next step now, we'll punch a hole in the cap on this side and slide it over. This is a Roper Whitney punch. It takes different size punch heads in it. We're going to set that head of that pin right in there, like so. And we're going to kind of level it up. And then I'm going to slowly run that head down. Can you see that pin going? And we're going to get there. And then all I have to do is squeeze that. And we've punched a hole in that pin. And here's that little baby piece of gold right there. And we'll save that because that gold's worth money. So now we have punched a hole in the head of this, and zoom in here, and we'll see we got a hole right in the center of that cap. But what we need to create is a shoulder around that, so when we drive this pin down, that pin will fold over and actually hold that cap down. So I do that by just taking a drill bit, and you can't do this in the machine. I just do it by hand, and I hold it, and I just spin that drill bit. That gold is soft, and I just eat away at that head. This gold's not super thick either, so you know, using a machine for this just scares me, and we don't need a huge shoulder, so I just kind of eat away at it. You can stop it. Okay, so now we've created that shoulder inside that hole, and it's going to be really hard to see on the phone or on the video, but there's a little bit of an angle of a shoulder all the way around that pin can grab on. All right, so now we get the dirt out of that, and we're going to set that right over this pin on this handle. So we just put it over that, and that cap just falls right down over that pin. But now we've got too much pin sticking out of that head, which if we tried to hammer that right now, it would just fold over. But too much is better than too little. So we're going to take and we're going to trim just a little bit off with our pliers here. Okay. And now I'm going to go to the disc grinder and just touch that pin back just a little bit more until I kind of get a square head there. So I'm actually now that I kind of see what I have, I'm going to take that out, and I'm going to just touch that pin off without the handle away. And then I'm going to round it just a fuzz. And we'll test our depth again. We can always do it several times in order to get it right. We don't want to take too much off. And that's actually looking really good right there. So we got a little bit of pin sticking up that we can fold over. If it's too much as we're hammering, we can always take a file and kiss that off just a little bit. Okay, so off camera here, I just went to the buffer and I just buffed that head up a little bit to get kind of some pre-polishing done before I actually hammer it down on the knife. But when you do that, you can get buffing compound down in this hole. So I took a Q-tip and some acetone and I just cleaned that hole out, and I cleaned the backside of that pin out to make sure that's clean. If you don't, when you hammer that pin down, you could have dirt in there and you'll end up seeing a black ring around your pin. The other thing that you have to be careful about, this pin will go in this knife without any epoxy. Okay, this handle is already all epoxied together and done. When I put this head on right now for the final time, I do not put any glue or epoxy on that because I don't want it squeezing up around that pin. When I peen that over, the same thing, you can end up seeing a line. I want dry gold against dry gold. So now we're gonna go to the peening process and hammer it together. Okay, so as you see here on my little metal vise, or my little metal anvil, I have some blue tape protecting the backside of this pin. It's still gonna get dented a bit, but I don't really wanna scarf it up too bad. And then I'm kind of looking, I don't wanna bang up these other pins real bad on this side either. So I'm gonna overhang those pins off the back, and I'm gonna place the pin that we're actually hammering down on directly down on that blue tape on that surface. And so now we're gonna just begin to hammer. And every now and then we stop and look. Okay, that pin's wanting to raise up just a little bit here. We'll just kind of chase it back down. Okay, and then I'll place it back here. Okay, and I'll look. Now it's starting to lay down nice. And I'm gonna start chasing that pin around that head. I'm taking great care to not hit the wood. We'll take a look, make sure everything's tight. Okay, it's looking pretty good. I'm gonna actually turn this one here and I'm gonna drive this head down just a little bit. That sat down pretty good. And then I can adjust the angle if I want a little bit. I can come on this side. And it looks like those are sitting down pretty nice. So now I just got to take my sandpaper and just clean that head up a little bit. Okay, this is my sanding stick that I use. It's just an old file with all the teeth all ground off of it. It's super smooth, no sharp edges really. And I just wrap a piece of 2000 grit right around that. And I've masked off those other pins in the wood just directly right there so I can kind of get up against that if I need to. But with 2000 grit paper, just run around it and work on taking off those flat spots. And I just keep rolling my paper to new fresh paper. And I just sand that pin up. And it'll take a few minutes, but you'll get it to where you get most of the hammer marks out, and then the buffing wheel will help smooth out the rest of your little flats. But this is getting out really the worst of the hammer marks. There's a lot of guys that will wear a pair of optivisors. If you're getting to the point where you need glasses, you can sure wear
optimizers while you're doing this. Some guys will do it under a microscope if they have engraving equipment. So far I have pretty good eyes for now. I'm liking the way that looks. So now I'll take that to the buffer and we'll see how it looks. Buffing compound. I'll just come in here and hit that pin kind of from all angles. Okay, so now I'm sanding the other side of the pin. This is the side of the head that was down. It's a little dented up from the hammering. This side won't take quite as much sanding. You know, the other side didn't really take a lot, actually, but I'm just cleaning this up with paper, and then I'll go back to the buffer and do the same thing I did to the other side. The advantage to soldering the pin in one side of this is I only really have the risk of one side, one pin showing. The other side, this side, is completely solid. So I don't have to worry about a ring around a pin. I don't have to worry about hammering both sides. I only really need to worry about one pin in that peening process. It takes, you know, 50% of your risk out. The other thing I'd like to talk about in this is the rest of these pins, these two pins and these two pins back here, they also go all the way through the knife as well. So it ties this whole knife together. These two pins, I just solder in small short pins that go halfway through and they epoxy in like a tack. They're still holding and they're still serving a purpose in here. But if this epoxy was to ever try to let go, or the wood was to ever try and move, these pins and these three pins back here are holding that all together. So even with bad epoxy, this knife should never come apart. Okay, so I'm in here now with a little bit of oil on a Q-tip, and I'm just going around these pins, and I'm cleaning up any of that buffing compound and that tape residue that got stuck in there. And now we're just gonna kind of dry up that oil just a little bit with your t-shirt. And then I kind of do a final inspection of that pin. Make sure that that is not showing. And you can look right in there close and there is no ring around that pin. This was the side that we peened down. This is the side right here that had it was soldered to the inside of the cap. So that is how Tim Hancock does a dome pin for the most part. I probably over the years have, you know, wavered, done a couple things different than he did. Since he showed me what he does, he probably came up with some other methods. Tim was great about, if you had a problem, solve it. Come up with a method. That way, if you ever make this knife again, you have a perfect method. And Tim was super important to me, and he was really smart about the way he went about making a knife. If something was giving him problems, he stopped and he figured it out all the way. And he solved that problem to where maybe something that wouldn't be perfect on someone else's knife was perfect on his, and it was perfect every single time. So, in honor of Tim Hancock, that's a Dog Bone Dagger, and I'll never forget the man, and I'll always appreciate what he meant to me and what he meant to knife making. So, here's to Tim.